Okay, there you go. So while Helen's taking a look at the Hoppins guidance on the question of sharing PowerPoint, I would like to introduce Imogen Wall. Imogen is a disaster response expert and a former journalist, now mental health professional and a licensed instructor with Mental Health First Aid England. She runs courses of all sorts for all sorts of people, from 90-minute self-help modules to full mental health first aid qualifications. She has a superpower. It's combining technical mental health knowledge with her experience as a frontline responder to design and deliver courses that speak with the authenticity of lived experience. That's something we're really trying to highlight with the initiative, are resources that are available by people that have the experience of being in aid and development. So that's terrific. Mary Ann has interviewed Imogen for the Embodying Change podcast. And that interview I will put in the chat. I really recommend you listening to that. It got a lot of appreciation there, so I'll put that link there. But I actually first got to know Imogen through her connection with the platform 50 Shades of Aid. And that's where I personally wrote about my burnout story in 2018, 2019. And I was really impressed with the amount of support that came from the aid community on others who had burnout. So I really appreciate that platform that was created by her and others. So without further ado, Imogen, I'd like to hand over to you for this special workshop.
Awesome. Thanks, Melissa. It's a pleasure to be here. Yes, I'd forgotten that podcast. It was about a year ago now. It feels like 100 years have passed since then. So much has changed. And yet throughout it all, you guys have been plugging along with this piece of work, which is so close to my heart. And I'm so glad you found some support on 50 Shades of Aid. It's interesting. People always ask me why I started that platform, and the answer is I started it for a small group of friends. We had no idea that there were, of the demand and how much value people would find in the space. Now 25,000 people and counting. Yeah, mental health there has been, it's very close to my heart, as due to the experiences I've had personally and professionally, and friends of mine. And I've always been absolutely horrified at the inability of the aid world really to have conversations about this topic. And yeah, back in 2015, we did a lot of work on 50 Shades of Aid with the Guardian newspaper, particularly writing articles and sharing experiences, and still the conversations play out. So I'm glad you found support there. I think many people have. I can't really take credit for it anymore. There's a whole gang of admins. It's a big project now. But yeah, it exists for people to talk about things that they can't talk about somewhere else. And sadly, mental health has been one of them, although I think that is really changing, largely thanks to what you're doing.
Yeah, thank you so much. Helen is asking if you could share your slides with her. Help that. And while you're sharing the slides, I could, yeah, basically.
Okay, let me see. I think, do you know what? We could just, it would be slightly me flying blind,
Okay.
but we could just go ahead, and I will just talk at a screen. It's useful to see people's backgrounds.
I know.
That has been really helpful. So it looks like we've got quite a range here. I'm going to say right off the bat, we've obviously got some people who are professionals who know a lot about mental health first aid, or work in first mental health already. And we've also got some people who don't at all. So I'm going to try and pitch this so it works for both groups. And let's see how we go. If people have questions, please do stick them in the Q&A. I can't see them, but Melissa and the team can, and they will jump in, and hopefully we'll have some time at the end to answer your questions. So I'm not ignoring you if you put something in the chat and I don't answer it immediately. But yes, okay, let's get going. Let's not lose any more time. So this session, this hour, is me really kind of talking about mental health first aid, what it is, and why aid workers should care. I am an MHFA instructor. I'm also a qualified therapist. I think, let me show you this. So yes, Melissa, you introduced me very flatteringly. I did about 15 years of frontline work with the United Nations mostly. I am somebody who grew up with mental health issues in my family. My dad suffers from depression. I had a diagnosis of depression before I even started my aid career. So I like to think after multiple missions and multiple postings, I was reasonably successful. So it's more than possible to continue to have full and fulfilled professional career while carrying diagnoses. They did come back to bite me from time to time, but I know what I'm doing now with those. That picture, though, was the emergency that really took it to a new level. That picture is me on an earthquake in Haiti, on a helicopter in Haiti, about, this would have been the end of October, roughly. So after the earthquake, after the cholera outbreak, just as we were having a hurricane. I looked really happy, but about a week after that picture was taken, I collapsed in the office with what was initially exhaustion and then subsequently turned out to be burnout, and took about 18 months-ish to recover from burnout. So that, among other things, set me on the path of thinking a frontline role was less for me in the future. I came back to England. I trained as a therapist. I did volunteer work. And then I trained as a mental health first aid instructor because I realized that actually what I like doing is engaging with people, not just on a one-to-one basis. And what I really like is to present the stuff that I wish I'd known back in the day before I even got on an aeroplane in the first place. So mental health first aid is just one aspect of this, but it's a relatively, I want to say relatively new concept. It's actually not, but when I talk to people, I find out it is. So in this format, it's not something a lot of aid organisations, certainly outside the UK, are familiar with. So I'm going to walk you through, first of all, and I'm delighted we've got some people here who are trained mental health first aiders. Hopefully this is all reinforcing what you've already learned. Mental health first aid, it's the concept actually is quite simple. It's the counterbalance, the equivalent of physical first aid, really, and certainly the argument here in the UK and the other countries in which the MHFA movement is active is that offices, workplaces should have mental health first aiders in exactly the same way that they have physical first aiders who are required by law here in the UK. Mental health first aid, it's, as with physical first aid, it's the provision of immediate support to someone in emotional distress. That distress may be visible, maybe not visible. One of the things we train mental health first aiders in is looking for signs and symptoms that may not be obvious to others, may not even be obvious to the individual themselves. It's for non-professionals. Anyone can learn and implement the principles of mental health first aid. You do not need to be a therapist or a doctor. Indeed, we explicitly say to people, we are not training you to be therapists. That's not what this is about. The core principles of mental health first aid are that it's all about connection. It's about helping people feel safe. That is the primary, most important reaction to somebody who is struggling. It's creation of safety and connection to another person. It's about helping people find the next step, find out where they're going to go for further help. That may be professional help, it may be non-professional help, it may be formal help, it may be informal help, it may be some work they do entirely on themselves and changing some things about their lives. And that last bit is really important. The agency of the person you are supporting is at the core of the mental health first aid principle. You're there to provide support and space for somebody, not to fix them. It's all about their agency. So it's not about telling people what to do. It's not about solving people's problems for them, nor is it a substitute for professional support. It's an in the moment, how to say the right things at the right time, nor is it a long-term approach. And that's really, really important. We're not training people to provide primary support for long periods of time. As with physical first aid, you might be able to help someone who's broken their leg get to a doctor, but you're not the person who can fix the broken leg. So that's the principle. In the aid workplace, I think this has been part of my work over the last year since MHFA England's course went online. Previously, it was in-person training. That has meant that I can open it up to a much wider range of people. And it's also meant that I can augment and add to the content I teach to make it specific to our context. And drawing on my experience as well as my training, primarily, it's it has a really important role in the safeguarding of welfare of staff. This is about identifying symptoms, about supporting people in the workplace, and making sure that there is capacity within the organisation to provide that frontline initial support. So with that in mind, it has a significant contribution to peer support and peer support work. I think it's not a peer support project in and of itself, but when I'm working with organizations, sometimes I will work with a small organization and I say to them, I think you should put 2 or 3 people through this training. Like, don't put just one person through, because then they'll be on their own in the workplace. I also run tailored courses for organizations. If you have more than 8 people, I can teach between 8 and 16 at one time. So more than 8 people, I will do tailored courses for organizations. But definitely more than one person, it can be an important cornerstone of a peer support system internally. A key part of the mandate is tackling stigma. And teaching people how to have conversations and how to start conversations from an advocacy and a stigma tackling basis, rather than just as a private conversation between one and one. So we talk a lot about language and use of language in the workplace. All of that means it has a really important role to play in building healthy and safe teams. One of the things that we really try and do is build up people's confidence in speaking about mental health. And often, as with EAP systems, for people, knowing that there is somebody there is all they need. They don't actually need to use the resource, but knowing that it's there helps create safety within teams. It's not a substitute for TRIM training, but obviously there's a role in handling critical incidents. And empowering and supporting managers. This is something I'm really passionate about at the moment, because I've spoken to so many managers over the last year who really want to provide support to their teams, and whose teams have really been asking for a lot of emotional support over COVID, but managers who do not feel equipped to provide that support. And so they get pressure from both sides. They get pressure from their personnel pushing upwards, saying, please help us. And they get pressure from senior management saying, that's on you, managers, to look after your teams. But nobody actually equips the managers in the middle with the skills they need to handle conversations or to direct people to further support. It definitely needs to be part of a wider strategy. I think that's really important. It's also not a substitute. This is what we're talking about here, is really in the workplace between colleagues. I wouldn't recommend it as a substitute, or think it's automatically transferable to mental health work with severely affected populations. That does require specialist support. This is really about how to have a conversation. So the MHFA movement works in 24 countries. It actually started in Australia. It's the English branch, where I'm an instructor, is a UK government recognised organisation, and the certificate is recognised by the UK government. The key indicators we measure, and one of the nice things about the courses we do pre and post evaluation. So the post-training evaluation is done independently by MHFA England, not by me, for all of my trainings. So I get sent the outcomes afterwards. And typically that kind of graph is what we're after. That's the last open MHFA course I taught. Shows the before and after in confidence and knowledge. Those are our 2 indicators. And it is really nice for me as a trainer having an indicator set there that I can use. The core curriculum from MHFA England covers depression, anxiety, suicide, eating disorders, and psychosis on topics. Also, primarily, it's about training people to apply a response model, which we're going to talk about in a minute, regardless of the presentation, partly because we absolutely do not diagnose. I don't diagnose as a therapist. Mental health first aiders, we steer them absolutely away from any thoughts about diagnosis. The augmented version that I teach, that I've developed based on my experience and my extra training, covers PTS, PTSD, vicarious trauma, burnout, and remote support. We also look a little bit at post-traumatic growth, which is a really interesting area for aid workers. So what I'm going to do now is just walk you through kind of what we teach people in terms of how to handle a conversation, what MHFA is in practice. for those of you who already know all this stuff, hopefully it'll be an overview of what you can expect if you send any staff through an MHFA course, or if you want to recommend anybody. For those of you who are interested in taking the course, hopefully it's a taster. For those of you who are just interested generally, hopefully I'll be able to send you away with some practical skills, at least. So MHFA starts, and this is something I care about very much, with this principle, which I guess most of us haven't seen an image like that for a while, but it's the airbag on an airplane principle, that you must put your own airbag on before you help other people. And this certainly for me has been one of the biggest shifts psychologically, sort of philosophically, in moving from aid work primarily to working in mental health, is this idea that actually your self-care isn't an optional extra, and nor is it an indulgence. It's actually a core part of your job. And for me, I'm a member of the BACP, which is the British Association of Counselling and Psychotherapists. And this is point 2 here. This is point 2 in my ethical code. My professional standards require me to ensure that my well-being is sufficient to sustain the quality of the work. So that means that self-care and my well-being is an ethical responsibility that I am required to adhere to as part of my code of conduct. And for me, that was a huge shift away from being in an aid sector, which regarded self-care as at best, a luxury, and at worst, a dangerous and distracting self-indulgence. I cannot tell you how much this has done, like making this shift, particularly in that I found it enhanced my ability to work on the front line. I started by volunteering at a suicide hotline in New York, and found that very quickly that the very strong peer support and debriefing and mental health support system they had hardwired within their organization actually was what enabled me to spend hours on the phone talking to people who were really quite unwell. And I could not have done that without the support. So this kind of dichotomy here we have between sort of oppositional way that it's set up in the aid sector, that it's our health or those are the people we serve, is I absolutely reject and challenge. I don't think we can offer our full selves to affected people unless we take care of ourselves. So that's where we start. As mental health first aiders, we really, self-care and self-management is a really central part of what we do and what we teach. In terms of supporting someone who's struggling, the model is something called ALGIE. And you'll find, if you look at psychological first aid, so same but different, mental health first aid, they all have some kind of system for approaching a conversation. And in MHFA's case, it's ALGIE. It's deliberately presented as a circle because it is not linear. You will normally start at A, but not always. And you may well in a single conversation loop back between these. Also, you're not necessarily going to cover everything in a single conversation. But this is what ALGIE stands for. So the A is approaching, assessing, and assisting with any crisis. And we do crisis management. Then the L obviously is listening. And then the giving and encouraging, you'll see that's all about providing options to people. The word advice is not in there. We do not do advice. We do not, we suggest and we encourage, but there's the autonomy of the individual is there at the center. So in some conversations, we say to people, you may not get beyond the L. You may just sit and listen. That may be all you do. Particularly if someone's very stressed and they're not taking much in, it's not the time to give them a whole load of options. You might listen and give someone some information, and then they give you some feedback, and so you feed that back into your A, into your assessment. So it's absolutely not linear. But this ALGIE model, this is the absolute core of what we teach. Then we teach the importance of doing groundwork. Now I love that picture of the lighthouse, because that's what I say people like and mental health first aiders. Anyone who's struggling is very careful about who they talk to, usually, and they make quite careful assessments about who is safe, who they can trust. to come to. So part of being a mental health first aider is being the lighthouse and sending the light out. It's a very English thing, a lighthouse. For those of you who don't have them, they sit on rocky outcrops in England where ships are likely to hit rocks, and they send a light out to warn the ships that they're near some dangerous rocks. So you're passing information. You're always saying, look, I'm here. You can come to me. And we do a lot of practical stuff around this as well, like how to share information in your organization, to get to know mental health support resources in your area or in your country of deployment. One of the things that we add in the course for aid workers is very much you get a bit of homework where you have to go away and map what your organization offers and what's available within your country, and find out things like, is making a suicide attempt technically illegal in your country, which it is in some. So marshalling your resources, getting your knowledge in order, getting to know what's available, and making sure people know that you are available. And then it's up to them if people do come forward. You never know who's listening, is the principle. So the approach, assess, assist bit, this is what we teach people. If this is from the starting point that there is somebody you're worried about and you want to have a conversation with them, this is how you might go about that conversation. And this is where we find people have a lot of anxiety. They're like, how do I begin a conversation with somebody who I think is struggling, particularly if they haven't turned to you in the first place? And we say, do a lot of planning around it. Think about when, where, and how you might have that conversation: in the office, out of the office, in a neutral space, or in a space where they feel safe. Do you want to be sitting with them, or like the ladies in this picture, do you want to walk with them? Side-by-side conversations are hugely powerful. It can be a lot easier to talk, actually, if you're not looking directly at somebody. Anybody who's had a really good conversation in a car, for example, will know this. It's sometimes easier for people to open up. So you think about, in all of that, you think about what suits them, where they're going to be happiest and most relaxed and feel most comfortable talking. And in terms of starting the conversation, we just encourage people to just ask how they're doing and wait for the answer. There's no great mystery or secret to starting a conversation. You don't have to go straight in with, I think you're looking unhappy. Give them the option first of all. However, there are a couple of tips. One is that if that's too broad, you can consider asking them specific questions, ask after somebody, ask how a certain situation is going. Sometimes that's easier for people to answer than a very big kind of how are you question. And the ask twice principle is something we really hammer home. So if someone says they're fine, but they don't sound it, and you are concerned because your assessment is that there is something wrong, don't be afraid to ask again. We're very socially conditioned to say we're fine. The first time someone says, how are you? You just say, oh, it's okay. And it's pretty universal. I'm well, thank you. Everything's good. So sometimes even if someone does want to talk, that social conditioning gets in the way. So asking twice, giving someone a second opportunity, saying, it's good to hear, but really, how are you? Can be really, really powerful. And if necessary, you can say why you're still concerned. Just say, I've noticed you being a bit down. I've noticed you didn't come to the last few Zoom calls we had, which just will convey concern, no matter what you're actually asking about. This is also really important. If they still say, I'm absolutely fine, believe them. Remember that how important their agency is. Don't push. They just may not be ready to open up yet. But now they know that you care. And it's amazing how, I always say this to people, and I don't know if they believe me, but I've seen it so many times, that actually this alone, that kind of conversation alone, can be really powerful. Particularly if somebody is struggling and they haven't acknowledged it to themselves yet. It could be weeks or months later, but I have spoken to many people for whom the tipping point, when they started to realize actually they did have an issue, was somebody being concerned, somebody asking, even if they didn't respond to it at the time. So you can have a really powerful conversation, even though at this point you will probably feel like you failed. You will feel like they don't want to open up to you, but you've offered them the space, and that's all you can ever do as a mental health first aider. So step back, tell them they can always talk to you and stress that you care about their welfare. They know now that you're somebody that they can speak to, and you can leave it at that. It's not your job to get somebody to open up or get them to express their feelings. That may be all the conversation is, and it may be super successful. As a kind of addendum to that, this is something I've added into my section, my aid worker section, because it's not covered in the core course. How to provide support remotely is a really common question that's coming up at the moment. So there's a lot on this screen. I'm going to tell you now, I've adapted a lot of it from the BACP advice. The BACP advice put out some recommendations for therapists. And so I've adapted that for mental health first aid. If you're working remotely, having to provide support to somebody who's a long way away. The first is to choose the platform again that works for them, same as in person. Bearing in mind that might not be one that involves voice or pictures. They might be happiest with email or happiest with text. WhatsApp might be their chosen platform. So you go to where they are, you go to what they prefer. And they may, even if it's on a call like this, they may be happier with no camera. Give them the option. Some people find it easier to talk if they don't feel like someone's staring at them. And we all know after the last year how intense digital interactions can be. Body posture and facial expression matter if you're on camera. So you sometimes have to exaggerate a little bit to stay engaged, but don't kind of go fiddling with your phone or looking around you, or you can always tell if someone's looking at another platform. Incidentally, someone's on Zoom but they're actually looking at their email, you can tell. Using a platform where you're not time limited, so if you're on a free Zoom, it times out after 45 minutes, and let them choose the time. This has caught me out. I know it sounds really obvious, but making sure that you're plugged in before you start. Otherwise, you'll get to the crucial point and your screen will go, you'll get that message saying your battery's low. And you'll have to interrupt a flow to run around. Platforms that are secure, sounds obvious. Also, confidentiality particularly if you're speaking from home, making sure the door is closed, you are alone, there's nobody who could overhear. It takes a bit of extra effort to ensure confidentiality. Standbys. Looking into the camera rather than at the digital image of their face is really hard, but on some platforms, you can move your screen image around and the image of them around. And if you can, try moving the screen image of them as close as possible to the camera on your laptop so that the difference between where your eyes are is nowhere near as pronounced. I think you can do that on Zoom. It's a really good tip. If you're writing, careful attention to language, because lots of nuances lost in text. It's very hard to convey tone, for example, in text. If somebody is in really acute distress or you think they're in crisis, we train people to handle that. I'm not going to go into it now because it's important and technical, and there's not time to do it justice now. That picture, of course, is of Mr. Mutu, who was at Amnesty International for many, many, many years, and very sadly took his own life in the office, leaving a note which referred to work pressures as part of the reason he had taken such a irreversible step. Suicide is not something that's discussed in our sector. That's one of the very few on record, actually. I've had private conversations with people where they're quite sure that somebody they worked with took their own life, but there is not a single study or piece of research into suicide or suicidal ideation in the sector, and I don't think it's something organizations want to talk about, which I think is, when you look at how far the military is, how far ahead militaries are at talking about suicides, people who've left the military, I think it's a massive, massive gap. So we do teach people to respond to somebody in distress. Essentially, this is the advice we give them, and this is the training, rather, that they stay calm, talk to them slowly, that we teach them how to assess suicidal risk and what to do if somebody is very high risk. And we teach them that this is the point to breach confidentiality, which is in line with those of you who've got training as therapists or as medics will know that if somebody expresses that they may be at risk of hurting somebody else or of hurting themselves, your obligation to keep a conversation confidential becomes an obligation to bring somebody else in. And this goes back to, as I said, we're training people to be bridges, essentially. We say there's no prizes for trying to manage a situation on your own. That really, if you are feeling out of your depth, the best thing you can do is bring somebody else into the picture. And we talk about what is appropriate in different country contexts for responding to somebody who is high risk. But this is key, again, to underline knowing what local resources are available. And then the L bit of algae, we spend a lot of time training people in listening, and particularly in active listening, which we're going to talk a little bit about now. I think this bit in green is the bit that we really want to land. Everybody understands why active listening is important for you as the person who is providing the support. We know what it feels like to be really listened to, how validating it is. We know that we can't really understand what's going on until we really listen to somebody. And we understand that letting people express how they're feeling is a really powerful process for them. And it helps them make sense. But that last point, talking about their feelings, helps people listen to themselves, is the bit we really try and land as mental health first aid trainers, to make people understand that actually the other person they're talking to, the person they're helping, is also listening. So you are supporting their listening process. They may be listening to themselves. They may be expressing something that they've not been able to put words to before, something that they've not actually admitted to themselves until that point. Now, it may not be on purpose, but you are not the only person listening. And that feeds very practically into what we teach around the techniques. I do have a little video here, but I'm not sure if I play it, you're going to get the sound. So I've got a slide version as well. So let's see, file. So active listening, those of you who've got training will know this. Okay, but it's the nice thing about listening is that it boils down to most fundamental level. You can learn how to be a good listener. And that's really what mental health first aid is about in a very big way. There is this perception that listening is something we're either born with or we're not, that people are good listeners or they're bad listeners. And actually, it is categorically not true. Everybody can learn how to listen. Everybody can be really good at listening. It does take practice. It is a skill. I think it's a superpower, essentially. Active listening, if you get really good at it, you start to learn to the emotional content of what someone is saying rather than the words. And that is an amazing thing when that starts happening. So what we teach with active listening, we teach people basic practical skills. We teach them to use techniques like open questions, which is ones that can't be answered yes or no. So that encourages someone else, they've got to actually come up with a sentence. We teach them about summarizing and reflecting, which is summarizing what someone has said to you, saying it back to them. It is amazing how often you do that and actually you've got it wrong. So even if you do get it wrong, we say, don't worry, it's not a bad thing. It shows you're really paying attention. You can always just ask them to say a bit more, particularly if they say something that sends your antennae up, but you can't quite figure out why. You can't quite figure out what's going on. Or if they pause a point, you can always just gently ask them to say more. And encouraging them to keep talking, because talking helps people process feelings. And this bit about silence, this goes back to the point about them doing listening as well. Silence can be really, really important within conversations, but we hate it as human beings. We like to fill silence. It feels very unnatural and very weird. But actually, letting silence sit is very important, because while silence may feel empty to you, to the other person, it could be the time that they are processing something they've just said or you've just said, or they're trying to find the words for what they're going to say next. And if you talk, if you feel the silence, you will interrupt that process. So actually using silence is really important, getting over our innate human dislike of silence. We teach people to react as well, just to be in a very normal and human way. One of the things you can always say in a difficult situation is, I'm so sorry that's happening to you, or that sounds really hard. And we teach people to think about their tone, especially important these days when we're working digitally so much. Tone and pace of your voice, how you say things matters sometimes as much as what you say. So rather than tell people what not to do, we give them the tools and techniques they need to keep going, and that's part of the confidence element. So we give them things like this: 6 things you can always say. People always worry that there's gonna be a moment where people look at them and they go, I don't know what to say next. So we give them things like this that you can always say, pretty much any situation. And some of them reflect back to those things. And we do a lot of role play. There's a lot of scenario work, a lot of case studies, a lot of working in groups, a lot of role plays, which I can't really show you here, certainly not in this format. But I did want to give you this example of the kind of thing of what we're teaching sounds like in practice. These clips are actually from the Samaritans, who are a British organization, the leading British suicide response organization. I've been going for decades. They're very well known here. They do a lot of training, particularly around handling suicidal feelings. But this is one of their exercises. I don't use this in the training because it's not MHFA, but I use it in the smaller courses, the shorter courses that I do, teaching people how to do active listening. Essentially, one of the reasons I like this is because it's literally a 1-minute conversation. And one of the things that people often assume about saying, having conversations with someone who's struggling is that it's necessarily a long, difficult and exhausting process. And it can be a long conversation, but also saying the right thing at the right time, playing a supportive role at the right time can actually make a difference in a dramatically short period of time and in a very unintense way, if that makes sense. You can really make somebody feel validated and heard very quickly, and that can have an impact within minutes. So I can try and send these links afterwards, but these 2 role plays are really great in just sort of illustrating how somebody might feel after literally a minute of not great conversation and a minute of really great conversation. We go back to self-care a lot on the MHFA training, and we talk about how to end a conversation. This is Samaritans taught me this, actually, as important as starting a conversation. Okay, that knowing how to wind something down is, you build a connection, but then you have to, it takes care. You can't just leave somebody. It takes care to end a conversation well. So we talk about how it's tiring talking about feelings. So conversations do often come to a natural end. And if someone does want to stop talking, then let them. It's not your job to keep somebody talking when they don't want to anymore. This next one is a top tip that Samaritans taught me, that asking people to think about, or asking them what they're going to do when the call ends. This is a really good way to kind of help the transition between a conversation and the time when that conversation is over, when someone can go back, particularly if it's on the phone or if it's digital, can go suddenly feel very alone again. So you're helping them plan how they're going to make the transition when a conversation ends. It's a really, really good tip. Saying you'll check in on somebody is another good way to end a conversation, but then you have to do it. You really must if you say you must. And then if it has been a difficult conversation, it's time for you to step back, check in with yourself, see if you're okay, do something you like, have a cup of tea. As a therapist, I need to work with a supervisor. If I'm doing one-on-one work, I have to have 1 hour of supervision for 6 hours of client work. That's my ratio, because people give me difficult emotions, and it's not a good idea for me to hold on to them. I need to take them somewhere else. I go and see a supervisor to process. And this again is this peer support thing, brings us back to the aid workplace, and the power of peer support, particularly in smaller organizations or organizations in where you're in places where it's very difficult to access an employee assistant program or something like that. That providing peer support is a really good way to handle stress on a day-to-day basis, handle difficult situations on a day-to-day basis. But if you have just provided support to somebody, it's important that you allow your mind and body time to recover. There is more information online if this interests you. So it's often psychological first aid is that often the language you hear a lot in our world. WHO published a really good one to psychological first aid in the time of COVID, really good handbook, and I can't find it online, or I would have given you the link. My organization, MHFA England, has lots of free resources, and Mental Health First Aid International is the place to go if you want to see if there's something tailored to your country or your context. They're very different. The English one is really active. It's one of the reasons I take people from other countries on my course, thing available to them in their home countries. But it's worth having a look. If you're Australian, you're all good. It's where it all started. Or you can come to my website and I'll tell you more, and or find me on LinkedIn. I'm always open to questions about all sorts of things. That's not actually my kitten, but it does look very much like my kitten. We got a kitten in February, and stroking kittens I highly recommend for stress, but that is a different workshop. So I think let's stop it there.
Thank you, Imogen. Thanks.
And I will come back to take questions. Gosh, look, we've got 10 whole minutes for questions.
Yeah, great
Very
content there. And I've learned lots of things, and it was a good reminder and refresher on some of the key elements of active listening, especially about what to do and what not to do. So thank you very much for this. We have some questions coming in. So I'll just start with the first one. Are you noticing any trends in terms of happening as a result of COVID? The Black Lives Matter, increasing also use of technology or accelerated digitalization that we all have in our organizations. Is there an increase in demand that you have been observing or witnessing for MHFA?
Yes, I think moving digitally has been a huge shift. I was a massive skeptic to start with, particularly about providing training online. I'm now a huge convert. It actually has advantages over face-to-face interaction, particularly that people can contribute anonymously. So it's one of the things we offer people when I train, is that people want to tell their stories, talk about something, but they don't want their face to be seen, or they're working with colleagues and they don't want colleagues to hear. They can send content just to me, and you can't do that in person. I think COVID has massively brought home to a lot of organizations, and particularly senior management, how significant staff welfare is, and how the very simple equation, if you don't take care of staff welfare, people literally start falling over, and you can't afford that. Also, I think it's forced senior management actually to go through some stuff, which is quite interesting. The people who who are often seen as quite removed, they've had to cope with loneliness and home working and isolation, and emails coming at them at all hours. And actually, some of the organizations I've worked with that have done really good work have been the ones where senior management model that openness. And actually, if you have a conversation about mental health within your organization, my number one tip is get your most senior person to speak first, because if they speak first, everyone else feels enabled to speak. I'm looking at the chat and seeing the point about guilt and shame, which is what stops many people talking out. I have to give a shout out to DFID, who I was working for last summer. They don't exist anymore, but when I was working for them, they did some really good town halls, and the permanent secretary, the most senior civil servant in DFID, opened one of them by saying, "I'm on my own and it sucks," and talked about that. And suddenly the floodgates opened.
Wow.
So there's a lot you can do without resources. Having said that, I think a lot of organizations are having this realization at exactly the time when they're really funding crunched. So it's even harder to make it an investment. But yeah, I think things are opening up a little bit, because it's coming to the point where people are going to fall over. I mean, there's a different workshop, but delayed reactions are a thing. Delayed consequences of having gone through the kind of stresses we've been through over the last year. There's about a 3 to 6 month window, and then people start falling over. So I think that's not going to go away. Equally, you get organizations saying things like, "I see we have to do something, but I've no idea what." Like, where do we start? Because they've never had to think about this before. And finally, I think a lot of people are starting to vote with their feet and look for organizations that actually are providing adequate support and the flexibility that they need. And a lot of it is about things like job security, but also mental health is massively affected by things like whether or not you know your contract's going to be renewed. So there's a lot of HR practices. So they're looking for organizations that take this stuff seriously. And I think those will recruit the talent in the future.
Thank you, Imogen. That's it's good to hear that from you. And I just, maybe another follow-up question is about the worry expressed by some participants around those who learn MHFA and maybe might feel overconfident in helping others. And what would be your thoughts about this, or your recommendations?
Overconfidence, I hope I mean, getting people to have a conversation. Overconfidence is the problem I want to have. I think we teach people very much not to go beyond the boundaries of their competence. That is hammered home all the way through. We do not diagnose. We don't advise. We don't push people. Sometimes the opposite happens. You can see that somebody's really struggling and they refuse to do anything about it, and you can't do anything about that. And that's really hard. But it is one of the reasons why having more people in your organization trained is a really good thing, because then you have that internal peer support network. People who've trained together tend to stick together. I'm looking up to see, there's a very good question from Flora there about potential need for support in people. You're not saying, such a good question. What you're really looking for, Flora, we'll come on the course, we'll train you. But what you're really looking for is changes in behavior. We're looking for significant shifts. Online, you might look for somebody who previously look at appearance. People stop taking care of their appearance. That's an indication. You're looking for people who turn their cameras off when they previously had them on. People who used to contribute and now don't contribute anymore. People who used to wear makeup and have stopped wearing makeup. Also, you're looking at their written work. This is an interesting thing. See, one of the things we do is this distance thing. How to support people at a distance. And when I did all my initial training with Samaritans, it was telephone only. So that's my background, actually. And the transformative amount you can do with somebody when all you have to work with is their voice. That is amazing. You don't actually have to see somebody. You really listen to what they're saying. It does make it hard if you don't know them. But Flora, I would also, if you're their manager, look at their work. Look for spelling mistakes, look for typos, look for them starting to miss deadlines, look for them asking for sick leave. If you're heading towards burnout, your immune system gets depressed and you get ill a lot. So anybody asking for constant sick leave, anybody emotionally overreacting to something that is you might think is quite trivial, but they take it very seriously. You're looking for all of those things. So there's a lot you can do, and that's exactly what a lot of the training is about spotting these things. And the final thing I want to say actually about the overconfidence thing is that one of the things we do teach people, and it is about confidence, is that one of the reasons it's so important to spot things and spot them early is because they're fantastically treatable, most of them. Recovery and the importance of recovery goes throughout the mental health first aid course. Not just the possibility, but the high likelihood of complete recovery from whatever is going on. So there's often a sense that a mental health diagnosis is some kind of that's it, your life is over, your professional life is over, and it absolutely could not be further from the truth. I said, I've done all my work in the field with, you know, I've gone through depression, I've gone through anxiety, I've survived burnout, I've still got a good career. It's not it's easy for me to talk about because I don't have kids, I'm financially independent, I work for myself, so I can speak. I've got the privilege to speak. There are lots of people in your organization who are not. So that point about injustice that Melissa is making there, the MHFA principle about creating space for people to speak, becomes a much bigger challenge in our sector, where we have to think about language, we have to think about the judgment of families. I ran a training for the British Embassy in Ghana, for example, last year, and I did lots of research for them into mental health in the Ghanaian context and the stigma and the marginalization and how that might impact how you create space for people to speak. It's fascinating. It's not just kind of like a ought to do. It's genuinely super interesting. But the more you can help people talk, the more you can help them get some support, which may be formal or it may be informal, the better their chances of recovery. The earlier you catch something, the better their chances of recovery. A well-treated first episode of depression has a much lower risk of leading to a subsequent. I mean, it's all clinically, the data is all there. It's all there. So that's what we really teach people in terms of the confidence. It's not their confidence in the ability to treat or manage a situation, or it's not just that. We also teach them about how much there is to be gained from taking steps towards getting help of any informal, formal description. Optimism may be a better word than confidence.
Yes, I want to apologize. I used the word overconfidence unskillfully. I took an MA as well, and we were also taught in our course, you're not a doctor who's going to be diagnosing people. You're helping reduce the stigma. You're opening up space for people to talk, and you're finding them ways to encourage them to seek professional help if that seems to be what's needed there. So I want to thank Gazelle for fielding those questions, and thank you, Imogen. It's been a wonderful conversation. I've already received some messages from people who want to get in touch with you to maybe engage you on some of your training. So I think you've put your information in the chat, but we also have linked to it in our resource repository that we're launching. If people want to get to know, but do you want to say anything more, Imogen, if people want to connect with you to perhaps engage you further?
Just find me. I mean, I was really keen for this session to be something with skills and content that people would actually take away, and not just a plug for what I do. So hopefully it's been that. But if people do want to get in touch with me, I've just put my website in there. It's not a very good website. I designed it kind of on the hoof last year. I've just opened the bookings for my next course, which will be in September. But yeah, get in touch. And I've built up such a library of resources, and I'm very happy for people to reach out. I'm part of a network of you guys and other people. So I'm the mental health aid principle of, you direct people on to the people who can actually help them is a very live one with me. So I will very happily help you try and find the resources, support, people, expertise, research that you need.
Wonderful. And you know what I was listening to your tips, and I already tried to move your picture right under my camera. So I'm more looking directly, because that was a very practical tip. So thank you. We're already improving ourselves. So thank you so much, Imogen. We really appreciate it. We will have this available as a video on YouTube, and they have your website to learn more. If you would like, now we're going to be transitioning to a session on mindful reflection and practice with Stephen Wainwright. I'll put a link to that in the chat. I think at least I would mindful reflection now before we enter the last part of our day. So big thank you to Imogen. Thank you, Gazelle, for helping with us. Thank you, Helen, on the tech. And thanks everyone for participating. I'll see you in the next session.
Thank you for having me, everybody. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you, Imogen. Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.